Here, Steelers and the Cowboys playing in this year's Hall of Fame game. They report to camp today on opposite ends of the country. The Cowboys are in Southern California, the Steelers in Pittsburgh. Plus, in just 50 days, the Buccaneers and the Cowboys will kick off the 2021 regular season in Tampa Bay. That is Thursday, September 9th. We are almost there. Welcome to NFL Live on this Wednesday. Dan Graziano here with Adam Schefter, Tim Hasselbeck. Ryan Clark's around here somewhere. We're looking for him. We'll round him up, and he will join us later. We're going to start with the Dallas Cowboys, one of two teams reporting to training camp today. They're out in Oxnard, California, where a cool breeze is blowing in off the Pacific Ocean, and we find our own Ed Werder. There he is. Hey, Ed, what's going on at the facility out there today in Oxnard?
Yeah, perfect weather conditions. Practice doesn't start till tomorrow, but the Cowboys did have their opening press conference, and we're all being, forced to follow unique protocols. In fact, media members covering camp are forced to wear these tracking devices. We had to present vaccination records and a negative COVID test. And despite all that, with the chairs spaced out 6 feet apart for the media press conference today, Jerry Jones walked apart from Stephen Jones and Mike McCarthy as they came in and went over and shook hands with a bunch of different media people, myself not included, unfortunately. But it was interesting that during the actual event, Jones became emotional several times during that press conference. And once was the sheer result of the gratitude he has for the Cowboys returning here to Southern California for training camp. In fact, Jones said he could be anywhere in the world, but there's no other place he'd rather be at this time. While describing COVID protection as more difficult than ever, Jones said there are a number of players in the pipeline, he said, in terms of their vaccinations, and only a handful have not had at least one shot. He does not believe that the protocols in place or the team's vaccination rate will put the Cowboys at a competitive disadvantage.
We have, out of our 90 players here, we have a handful that, in my mind, have still to commit to this. A handful, and a hand is 5. And that's iffy in that several of, in my mind, of that finger of 5 are on their way to potentially having their vaccine.
I was not particularly 100% on board with the vaccination, but through the relationships that we're fortunate to have in the medical community, you watch, you listen, and I think that same approach was given to our players, and to be able to watch the science, the numbers, and so forth. And then, I made a conscious decision to get the vaccination.
Well, there were several interesting moments here today, and one of them reflected the different philosophies between Jones and his head coach. McCarthy said he nearly crashed the truck he was driving when Jones called to tell him the Cowboys training camp would be chronicled by the HBO show Hard Knocks. McCarthy then laughed and said once he got the vehicle back on the road that he was all in. But Dan, I think it reflects that Jones is arguably the best marketer in the entire sports world, and McCarthy, like most coaches, values secrecy to the point that, remember last year during the inter-squad game at Cowboy Stadium, he removed all the numbers from the Cowboys jersey. So perhaps Jerry won this argument because he's Jerry, or perhaps it was because McCarthy had very little leverage with the owner after a 6-10 first season in Dallas.
Yeah, I'm sure HBO is going to want those numbers on there once the cameras come on. Once they do, Ezekiel Elliott, one of the prominent players that we'll keep an eye on, coming off a really rough 2020, finished with the fewest rushing yards, fewest touchdowns, and most fumbles he's ever had in a season. Tough year for Zeke. Ed, what are the Cowboys expecting from him this year?
Yeah, following the worst season of his career, Zeke Elliott, 2-time rushing champion, dedicated himself to improving his conditioning with a private running backs coach, Josh Hicks, working regularly with him in Dallas to create an opportunity to be more productive. And I think, having Dak Prescott and a healthy offensive line would certainly help as well. Whether he ever has a chance to contend for rushing titles under Mike McCarthy seems unlikely to me, but he can certainly be an invaluable part of a winning team.
Dallas finished third in the NFC East, going 6-10, and struggling with those injuries to Dak Prescott on the offensive line, as Ed just mentioned. Ed, thanks. We're going to have more from you later in the show. Back to Ezekiel Elliott, though. He averaged career lows last year in rushing yards per game and yards per rush. And in total, he had just 16 rushing yards above expectation, which ranked 33rd among the 51 running backs who had at least 100 carries. That is not Ezekiel Elliott level production. Adam, Zeke's buddy, Dak Prescott, the quarterback coming off a significant leg injury. What are you hearing about the Cowboys' plans for him as they start camp?
Dan, that was one of the big headlines that came out of today's press conferences with Jerry Jones, Mike McCarthy, the fact that Dak Prescott is ready for training camp and basically cleared for football activities, will be ready to go, will be out there, will be practicing after that Grizzly injury that he suffered last year. Did sign the big contract. He underwent the right ankle surgery in October, but is healthy. And he will be out there during training camp, taking his regular reps, going through drills. And that is a very encouraging sign for a Dallas team looking back to bounce back from the 6-10 season that, as Edward alluded, compromised some of Mike McCarthy's leverage in terms of the Cowboys being on Hard Knocks.
No doubt about that. Tim, when you look at this Cowboys team, obviously the quarterback, Dak Prescott, signs the big contract, always pressure on him. Who do you think is under the most pressure in that building in Dallas?
I think it's Mike McCarthy. And I'm not saying Mike McCarthy is in danger of losing his job, but, Ed Werder, referred to the season a year ago. Adam just mentioned it. And when we look back at his overall coaching record as a head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, people aren't going to say, oh, but Dak was injured that one year, or, oh, they had the distraction of Hard Knocks the next year, or, hey, we're going through a pandemic. No one cares about that stuff when they evaluate a coach. And when you think about why Mike McCarthy is in Dallas, it's because Jason Garrett, even though he won more games than he lost as the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, he didn't get them to where they ultimately want to be, which is as Super Bowl champs. And so I think that you go and hire a Super Bowl winning coach so that you aren't 9-7 or 8-8 or 13-3 even, and then get bumped out of the postseason. He's there because they expect to win a Super Bowl. And so I think the pressure is on him because there are many pieces on the offensive side, at least, that are in place for him to have success.
Well, Tim, guess what? If they have a down season, one of the Joneses is not going to go fire another Jones. They've already fired the defensive coordinator in Mike Nolan and replaced him with Dan Quinn. So now the pressure will be on somebody else. And for years, how many years did we go through this where we were wondering about Jason Garrett's future? And it's amazing to me that we're 1 year into the tenure of Mike McCarthy in Dallas, and it already feels like it's going in the same direction as Jason Garrett. Will there be constant attention, constant scrutiny, constant speculation about the head coach? But that's what happens in this league, really, in any city where there's not consistent winning, especially in a city where the family runs the organization, and especially with a team that's under as much scrutiny as America's team, the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, and Adam, that's why I think the fact that he's on his second defensive coordinator, Mike McCarthy is on his second defensive coordinator in just 2 seasons. Like, if it works with Dan Quinn, then that's great. That's part of the evaluation of Mike McCarthy. But if the defense struggles the way they did a year ago, which was epically bad, if that happens again, then the pressure is not going to fall back on Dan Quinn. It's going to go right back to Mike McCarthy. So I think how that side of the ball plays, which is really going to be the responsibility of Dan Quinn and those players, is still going to be in Mike McCarthy's lap.
Well, we're going to all